Good morning, early morning apple pecking. It's got a bag of apples which are going to be stored. Got some nice blackberries from recently, all nicely frozen in the freezer. And so this video is a kind of response in a way, I suppose, not really, to a video when I came home yesterday. I saw a video by Simon Roper. Simon Roper has a channel on YouTube. Immensely interesting young chap, an archaeologist with a penchant for linguistics and especially Old English, Anglo-Saxon, and started, I don't know if you're still doing that, Simon, a translation with Jackson Crawford on Beowulf and so on. Immensely interesting channel. Please go and visit Simon's channel. So he did a rather long video about consciousness, and I think it was called something like do you experience the same consciousness, or is it something like that. I'll link it below. And so and he comes from a very scientific, pragmatic position of, I think, predominantly, or first and foremost, the idea that everything is it's down to neurophysiology. All of our thinking processes, our language and inner worlds, and therefore our outer world, is all processes to do with neurophysiology. I don't think he discards entirely the idea of, or at least respects the idea of, spiritualism and people with a spiritual point of view, which I also do myself. But I'm also a bit of a science freak, and my profession is I'm a physiotherapist, but I specialise in neurological disorders. So yes, I'm very much neurophysiology and fascinated by how and why the brain functions the way it does, including linguistics. So anyway, he sort of hits on a couple of things that I'd already spoken about, but there were two things that were sort of interesting to me, and that was the religious people would say, which I've had myself, yeah, but how can you not see God? It's all around you. And I used to sort of think, what are you on about? You know, look at the trees. And I'd say, yeah, right, they're trees. Brilliant. And so there's that thing. So there's a schism between for the spiritual or religious person, the obviousness of God, and the person who's not privy to that information, the inability to understand what that would mean. Then there's, do we all experience the same consciousness? Which brings me to, what do we mean by consciousness? So I'll try and hit on that. Meaning the difference between vigilance, being aware of being, and qualia. And there was something else, but I'll get onto that. So yes, I've had all the discussions with religious people where they say, but don't you understand, God is all around you, kind of thing. I'm still not religious. I'm still pretty much, I suppose, atheist, though I have the understanding that there are more things than we are aware of, and could be aware of, and there could be things that we are aware of and aware, and air quotes, aware of without being aware of them. which sounds ridiculous, but meaning you may have receptors for these things that we haven't yet discovered, or they might be things that work in other ways and we just don't know the system yet, and yet you get that information from your body or your mind or your brain. So an example of this would be, I have had over the years many patients saying, oh, the weather's going to turn, I can feel it in my scar, right? And this regardless of whether the scar is inside and not visible to the outside or on the skin. And I would think, what a load of rubbish. But this has happened so often over the years, and people have been so accurate with, and they genuinely do have pain or disturbances, that at some point I thought, right, okay, so barometer, body's working like a barometer, it can feel the pressure, it changed the change in pressure in the air, changes the pressure in the body somehow, and that affects the scar, and they feel that somehow. So there might not be an actual receptor for that, it's just might be the way the body functions. It might even be a culmination of many factors that lead to the experience, the sensation of said thing. And it might be so almost imperceptible that you're not consciously aware of it. You can't say it's this exactly, but there's something there. So there are those things. They're quite difficult to pin down. Maybe this is the root of uneasy feelings, what the Germans would call Bauchgefühl. So like, trusting your guts or feeling it in your belly. I can feel it in my water, all of those kind of things. I can feel it in my bones. These sensations of something here is not as it should be, even though you have no conscious, logical and reasonable reason to believe that. So there are things, this makes me, the thing is, where I'm going with this is that I'm thinking that I don't discount, let's say, the idea that there are fundamental things going on around us, affecting us all the time, that we might not be consciously aware of, or in any describable way aware of, but they're there and they're affecting us. And seeing as and again, I don't believe things, I have a sliding confidence scale, or a scale of conviction, this might be the case. If you give me more information, I might move my scale. So the building blocks of everything, or the building block of everything, might make itself apparent. An analogy from Vedanta, they would say, there's a saucer, a pot and a vase. Yeah, all of those things are completely different, and they all have different shapes and they all have different functions, etc. But they're all made out of the same thing, which is the clay. And they would all know what it feels like, if they could feel, to be clay, because they all are clay. Yeah, one might be a vase, one might be a saucer, one might be a pot, but they're all clay. And so I think the same thing, possibly in this case, that there are effects of, as we're now seeing as well, quantum is quantum and classical is classical, but apparently that's not the case. It seems to be merging, so that when somebody says to me now, yeah, but what would the quantum world look like? I say, well, this, because this is the quantum world. We're separating it and saying this is a classical world and it behaves differently than the quantum world. Yes, of course it does. It seems to be, but I don't think there is no boundary between this world and this world. This is what a quantum world looks like on large scales. Some of those rules, maybe not all of them, still apply, like entanglements over long distances and so on. This is all being tested. So quantum effects might be feelable in such a gentle way that we're not actually aware of them, but they are intrinsically the way that we are. Yeah, the way I feel is a quantum effect, because without the quantum effects, none of this would be here. I wouldn't be able to feel anything, kind of thing. So it's a very subtle effect that it's having. Hammeroff and Penrose suggest that consciousness is a quantum phenomena created in microtubules in the brain. Maybe it's only realized in microtubules in the brain in this form and exists potentially outside of the brain before it's realized in the microtubules. Does it have anything to do with qualia? And so it's vigilance. It's the recognition of being, right? So qualia is the experiencing of things, say colour, smells, etc. But when you meditate, for example, you're trying to cut out as many qualia as possible. If you're sitting with your eyes closed, being very still, you're trying to reduce the qualia experience down to a minimal. I don't know if that's necessarily the intention. Might not be your intention to do that, but it's what seems to happen, so that you are concentrating experiencing more the state of actual being, just being. And that has a different quality to qualia, and seems to be, amongst many people, describable with very similar qualities. Vast expanse, no boundaries, blissful, happy, peaceful, contentment, shares many qualities amongst people who meditate. And I'm not sure whether that's the same thing as qualia. It's still an experience, but it's an experience of the self. But qualia is an experience of the self, isn't it? So that's a difficult one. And then the religious thing was, if I consider the entire thing to be a whole, so, let's go from the quantum fields in which quasi-particles exist, and if the disturbance in the field is strong enough for long enough, then an actual particle will appear in the field. Yeah? So an electron field, the disturbance in the field is such that it gives birth to an electron. The wave function collapses and an electron appears in the field, and then we can go there and measure it and say, there's an electron, and that electron will exist in the field for a given amount of time, be it milliseconds, hours, centuries, billions of years, whatever, until it's eventually absorbed back into the field. Those things make up everything that is, and they're not separated from the fields. So nothing is truly separated from anything else. I am not truly separated from my environment. Were the environment here, not here, I would not be. Were I not here, some parts of this environment would not be, because they require my presence and the disturbances I create within the environment for them to be able to take advantage of that. like my dead body when I mould in the ground. So it occurs to me that the whole thing is one system, or the whole system is one thing, right? And we like to compartmentalize things and separate things out, which is very useful for us. But in actuality, there is no separation between one thing and the next. I've done this in other videos. So I try to sometimes come from the other direction of thinking, well, maybe it's just all entirely one thing. And my inability to see it like that is just my inability. In actual fact, nature doesn't see itself like that at all. It sees itself as one thing, as one miasma kind of thing. And it becomes clear that there is no separation here at all between anything and one thing and something else. And so if you were to describe the most fundamental part of reality, the most fundamental thing of reality, the most thingless thing in non-duality, but if you were to describe that as God, then this would be God. And I think that's what religious people mean when they say, but can't you see that? And I understand what they mean. Let's not bother with how I see it. But you could describe it as God. But I look at that and I think, yes, I understand what you mean. Everything here is that one thing expressing itself in, hundreds of thousands of millions of different ways, but they are all that one thing, and so God is in everything. God is everything. Everything is God. It reminds me of the line from, I think it was Ram Dass, Richard Alpert, who had this discussion with somebody, and they say, yeah, but where's God in all of this? And he replies, what do you think is looking out of your eyes? The idea that you can go looking for God somewhere else is ridiculous, because you are it. It is fundamentally everything. Science, in a way, is ridiculous because it's God using an apparatus which is made out of God to look at something which is made out of God. The fundamental thing, I am, looking through an apparatus, microscope, which is still the fundamental thing, looking at something underneath the microscope, which is still the fundamental thing. It's looking at itself, and it's experiencing itself all the time. Everything that goes on here is being fed back, much like the brain system, where all information is constantly being updated. The memory of something, the Ist-Zustand, so the conditions that we have now, to be able to project that into the future and predict what's going to happen next. And this sort of feed-forward feedback system seems to be going on here as well, where it's gaining information about itself and it's adapting and changing. So this idea, this thing about religious people saying, I see God in everything, I can understand that. I'd be careful about calling it God using their definition of God. We might be all experiencing different qualia, and therefore our consciousness is not the same. We all have the sensation, the experience of actually being vigilant, being present, and that might not be the same. Some qualities of that might not be the same, but ultimately I think that is the same. I think it's the knowledge that you are, that will be the same. And the plant idea, maybe that's the same in everything, that thing has additional qualities, or the qualia can be pasted on top of that to give it to express itself in different ways, but the sensation of being I am is the same, and it doesn't have qualities, it just is. That was a bit of a long way around that, but that was sort of where I was coming from after watching Simon's video. Interesting. Been occupying me for years, all of this, and I don't conclude anything, pretty much like Simon. I don't really conclude anything from this. I don't say I believe or this is the case. They're just lines of inquiry that I like to wander down and think about. So I don't know. I don't know if that was helpful at all, Simon. But yes, fascinating. Have a nice weekend, everybody.